Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webcast, How to Bridge the Pay Equity Perception Gap, sponsored by Trusaic. This webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI and can be submitted for SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have any questions during the webcast, click on the Q&A tab in your webinar controls and type them there. A new tab will open in your browser with the webcast survey. Please be sure to complete it as soon as the webcast is ended. Our speakers today are Joanna Kim Brunetti, EVP of Regulatory Affairs and Chief Legal Officer at Trusaic. Joanna is a former partner with Aiken, Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld LLP, has over 20 years of experience advising clients on a wide range of employment, tax, intellectual property, and other related business issues. Our other speaker is Anuj Mongia, VP of Product and Strategic Alliances at Trusaic. As Vice President of Strategic Alliances and Product, Anuj is one of the company's principal product strategists and oversees ongoing expansion efforts into global markets. His vast, that's I've gotten myself out of control here. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Joanna and Anuj for the presentation.
Thank you, Hester, so much. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're located, and thank you so much for joining us today to discuss the topic of how to bridge the pay equity perception gap. You probably can feel, if you don't know, pay equity is really rapidly evolving in an ever-increasing clip. Pay equity, I think, historically has kind of been thought of in terms of pay discrimination and the attendant legal risk that goes with it. It's not, and if you are sure that you aren't engaging in pay discrimination, that's pretty much all you have to do, and you can ignore it. That's really kind of, that's kind of a historical approach to it. Now, pay equity is so much more. Is now an ongoing effort that is managed like every other sort of business division goal. It's woven into an organization's purpose and culture, announced as such. It's seen less as really a potential legal issue, which is what sort of a historical artifact kind of approach. And it's now part of a business decision. And moreover, it is measured and tracked through software and tools so that there's sort of ongoing knowledge of pay equity status. Next slide. So you might ask, well, what's driving this change? A very large component of that is the current labor market. The labor market really reflects the overall public sentiment, which is really driving pay equity, push towards pay equity. There's movements just from a few years ago, Me Too, Time's Up, Black Lives Matter. It's really made this issue forefront in everyone's mind. And then it's really been, underscored by COVID. And you might say, well, what does COVID have to do with pay equity? Well, there was a very disparate impact that COVID had, as between gender and as between or as among races. And so these kind of movements and events have really highlighted how pay inequity exists, and it's really top of mind more than ever. And one of the things, another kind of impact of COVID, not just this disparate impact for, minorities and women, but also, you probably heard about the Great Resignation. There's been so many workers changing jobs. And, in the post-COVID environment where, everyone was working remotely, that was the norm. That was particularly so in the professional workforce. And that's where attracting talent can be the most fierce. And then sort of, holistically, the workforce in general is just getting younger and younger, at least relative to me. And they have increasingly placed pay equity as an important consideration, in the employers they choose to work for. So this really kind of public sentiment, reflected in the current labor market, that is what's really driving this change. Next slide. So one of the sort of byproducts or impact of the change is what you see in pay equity laws. As you probably know, the Equal Pay Act and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, they were enacted in the 60s. So you're like, well, why are we talking about pay equity now? Well, as you probably have heard, the pay gap still persists, and the federal government is aware of that. States are aware of that. And as part of that groundswell of public pressure that I was just talking about, that's really turned into a tsunami, legislators at the state level have come to fill that void. And they're in a number of ways. And what they're all doing, these sort of pay equity laws, they're recognizing that if you just have a law that says you can't discriminate, that's just not enough. You need to do more to sort of address pay equity. And there are different ways that are being addressed. So for example, salary history bans, I'm sure you've heard of those. Those are like, there's 20 some odd states where there's a salary history ban. Well, what does salary history ban have to do with pay equity? Well, it's very on top of that. The idea is if Susie was paid, unequally at her former job, if you allow the employer to know what she's getting paid at her former job, you're just basically perpetuating that inequity. So the idea of the salary history bans is to like put everyone on a level playing field. So whatever negotiations a job applicant can do to get a new job, that job applicant is not going to be hindered by any pay discrimination that was going on in the prior job. So that is one facet of how to address pay equity. On the flip side is the pay transparency laws, and those are really, like, 2022 is the year of pay transparency, at least according to Inc. magazine. Pay transparency really deals with pay disclosures. And so on the one hand, the salary history ban, you can't ask the applicant what he or she was getting paid at their former job. On the other hand, the employer has to disclose what the range for the position is. This just became law in California, goes into effect Jan 1, 2023. That's for employers 15 or more. That's also true in Connecticut, Colorado. Colorado is really the first state to really, seize on this. Maryland, that was like a year plus ago. Nevada, Rhode Island, Washington, and then sort of individual cities like New York City, Toledo, and Cincinnati, Ohio. Massachusetts, there's one pending. There's also one pending, New York State, probably be enacted. So this is really, this has all been happening for the most part within the last year. And so as the employer, can't ask Susie how much she was getting paid before. And not only that, with regard to, for the job position, the employer has to identify basically the min-max of what that position, what the pay will be. So this is just, basically facilitate the a level playing field, whether it's on a gender basis or basis. So we have those pay transparency bans. And another angle, we have pay data reporting. Like states like California are requiring employers to report on their pay data. Basically, it's kind of a relic of EEO-1 Component 2 reporting. You may recall that was reporting that was put into place at the federal government, Component 2 reporting back in really during the very tail end of the Obama administration. With the new administration, that pay data reporting was halted, and after some sort of rigmarole and litigation, we had 2017 and 2018, and then that was it. There's actually significant talk about it coming back, but in the meantime, like states like California sort of filled that void, and they implemented that pay data reporting. California's pay data reporting is essentially employers with at least 100 employees, and now, as amended, with at least 100 labor contractors, typically like when you hire independent contractors as part of your workforce, or retain them through a temp agency or whatnot. You have to submit reporting similar to that Component 2 data reporting, which is, by job classification, race, ethnicity, and then what pay bands they fit into. As amended, now you also have to identify the mean and median range. And California also adds a sort of non-binary category under gender. So you'd have to identify by um, male, female, and non-binary. And this applies to employers with at least one employee in California. So it's very, very broad. Illinois has a slightly different angle. It does also require pay data reporting, but it also requires the employer to certify that they comply with all applicable pay equity laws. So they take it another step. So, you're like, well, what's with all these different pay equity related laws? There is an underlying understanding that pay equity is complex. It has to be handled by multiple avenues. And so what's happening is you have all of these different types of pay equity type of laws and regulations to try to, basically push towards pay equity. Another area, safe harbors. There's some states, and like Massachusetts has a safe harbor. If you can, to promote pay equity, if you conduct a pay equity audit, you don't actually have to achieve pay equity. But as long as you're making reasonable progress towards it, it's an affirmative defense to any Massachusetts pay discrimination, a violation of pay discrimination laws in Massachusetts. And so, you get the safe harbor for conducting a pay equity audit. And so, well, what's that all about? The idea is if you conduct a pay equity audit, you will be able to address any pay inequities that you see. As the saying goes, what gets measured gets managed. If you don't know what the inequity is, you can't do anything to remediate it or fix it. And with pay data reporting, you're submitting all this pay data to, to, at least in California, to now the California Civil Rights Department division, and you're submitting sort of the raw pay data. And what that's saying is, well, women in this position are getting paid an average of X. Men in this position are getting paid an average of Y. You're not going into any of the sort of wage influencing factors where it may very well be that based on tenure, seniority, performance, those kind of considerations will actually account for what seems like a really large pay gap. It may shrink your pay gap to sort of what I'll call a pay disparity, where you actually have potential legal risk from pay discrimination standpoint. And you will see, at least when you conduct that audit, you'll see that it's much lower. Now, you don't know how much lower it is, and you won't know that it is lower until you actually conduct the audit. But this gives you insight on how to address the problem, kind of going back to what gets measured, gets managed. So you have this, these different kinds of pay equity laws, whether it's pay transparency, salary bands, pay data reporting, pay equity auditing encouragement, if you will. All of these are designed to address the problem of pay equity. I want to also sort of talk about this pay transparency because it is so top of mind on most employers, sort of their dealing with employees, and HR management is such a big deal. So pay transparency, you're supposed to disclose the sort of min-max, essentially, the range, at least in California, for new employees. If you go ahead and do that, what impact does that have on your current employees? Like in Colorado, Colorado has a slightly different, rule with regard to what you're supposed to disclose. Colorado has also for internal promotions as well. So the different states that have the pay transparency laws, there's nuances to each one of them. But at the end of the day, what you're doing is, if you aren't actually coming up with a structured, thoughtful, compensation structure for your company, kind of doing these ad hoc, creates a lot of risk. And one of the sort of phenomenons that could happen is, among other things, is wage compression. The sort of old adage goes, if you want to get a raise, you need to get another job. Job jumpers, potentially get more money than someone kind of naturally getting promoted slowly through the organization, or just, through tenure through the organization. And so the idea is, if you've got one person, especially when there's a tight labor market, you've got one person who is jumping around, making, significant bumps in their salary, increases in bumps in the salary. Now they're applying for your company, and your you have a manager where this new applicant is supposed to report to. That person's a lifer, has been there with the company forever, a valued member of the team, perhaps maybe not one particularly vocal at least originally, in the salary increases. And then that person sees the salary range that you're proposing and announcing and posting to job applicants. And then you see that, and he or she's like, well, gosh, I'm getting paid within that pay range, and this person's supposed to be reporting to me. What's that about? So these are the kind of things that comes out with sort of an incomplete sort of pay transparency approach. And, as part of any sort of comp plan, you want to think about how it is you're structuring, sort of your salary ranges. And right now, more than ever, what you really want to do is conduct a pay equity audit to make sure that you are doing it in a disciplined and thoughtful manner. Now, I won't get into, there's a number of laws across the pond. So this kind of pay equity movement, it isn't in the U.S. only. It is very much alive and well, in the EU as well. Okay, next slide. So as I mentioned, federal equal pay laws have been on the books for over 5 years. But even now, because the pay gap still exists, the current federal government recognizes more is needed. The Biden administration appears to basically step in where the Obama administration has left off. And when you think about it, there's, I mentioned that component to pay data reporting that really was only around for 2 years. There's very much talk about it coming back. And query whether or not the state level reporting that exists, or that just really started, California, Illinois, whether or not those are going to be obviated by a federal national pay data reporting. That really remains to be seen, because at the end of the day, oftentimes when states will start, they'll pass laws that are not identical, even though similar to federal laws. When the federal law comes back, the states still remain, and then you just have more complicated, additional reporting burden. Okay, so with that, let me turn it over to Anuj Mongia, my colleague, to further discuss pay equity and really get into the nuts and bolts of bridging the pay equity gap perception. Anuj?
Thanks, Joanna. Appreciate it. So we're going to start with a poll question, and we're going to launch it. All right, there you go. It's launched. Going to give it a few seconds more. Okay, there you go. So we got the result. The poll that we asked was, now that the pay equity laws are coming into effect across the country and globally, what steps are you taking to ensure compliance with these laws? And 41% of the attendees responded that they are in the middle of conducting a pay equity audit. 26% said that they're working with in-house counsel and consultants on compliance. And then 33% indicated that there's nothing that's being done right now. So, about roughly around, I would say 66, 67% indicated that there is something that's being done, whether it's with the council or it's with a consultant, or you're just doing it internally. Next slide, please. Okay, so Joanna talked about all of the laws that are going into effect, in the US, as well as, she did briefly mention that there are very strict laws in EU. What we're going to get into now is what is the pay inequity costs that are associated, with not achieving pay equity or being litigated against, or failure to comply. So recently, you may have heard about the Riot Games and the Activision cases that were in the news. These were enforcement actions by the DFEH that resulted in the payment of huge settlements. And obviously, every employer wants to avoid that, right? Not to mention that you have bad press that is publicly there. So Riot Games had to settle for about $100 million, and as part of that settlement, 80 million was awarded to the minority female employees within the organization as pay, and then 20 million was obviously to the plaintiff lawyers and the legal fees. What was interesting about that settlement was that there was this reserve fund that needed to be established, and part of that was that Riot Games had to hire a pay equity consultant to perform a pay equity analyses and remediate, on those on identified problems if there were further problems that were identified. So, with these laws that are passing, with transparency that's happening, litigation is becoming more and more common, if you may use that word. But we internally look at risks of not achieving pay equity or pay inequity costs as really two different classes of risks. So there's the class one risk that we are pointing out here, which is a class action litigation or regulatory proceeding, settlement that happens. But then there's also the class two risk, which is really thinking about it from the brand erosion perspective, and more importantly, the employee disengagement and turnover. So we've been hearing consistently from organizations that employee focus groups are actually asking compensation teams, HR teams, total rewards teams, on whether or not the organization has conducted a pay equity analysis and what is the plan if they haven't conducted that, including they're asking, we've heard this, they're asking the focus groups that, what is the plan of incorporating equity in their compensation strategy? So really, class one risks are very, it's right there, it's the litigation risk, but the class two is also what organizations are really focusing on, which is, again, to reiterate, the brand erosion and the employee disengagement and turnover. And especially in today's time where you have the quiet quitting, or employees are, moving from, one organization to the other organization very frequently, getting employees engaged and reducing that turnover is becoming a high priority item for HR teams across the world. Next slide, please. Okay, so we looked at pay equity as a risk. We looked at what the pay inequity cost is, but also what's very interesting is that pay equity is an opportunity. Profits and pay equity are not inconsistent. To the contrary, there's the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, addressed CEOs, addressed in his annual letter, and I'm gonna quote him here. Basically, it said, "Profits are in no way inconsistent with purpose. In fact, profits and purpose are inextricably linked. Profits are essential if a company is to effectively serve all of its stakeholders over time. not only stakeholders, but also employees, customers, and communities. Similarly, when a company truly understands and expresses its purpose, its functions with the focus and strategic discipline that drive long-term profitability. Purpose unifies management, employees, and communities. So really, what we're getting at here is that pay equity is really an opportunity. If you do achieve pay equity and you're able to communicate that to your employees, to stakeholders, to shareholders, it is actually an opportunity to build a better organization overall. So, there's a poll that was conducted, and 81% of workers are more productive and engaged when they believe that they are paid fairly. 75% of the employees are more likely to apply for a job when the company promotes pay transparency. 90% of job seekers say it's important work for a company to embrace transparency. And this is also even echoed in surveys from Indeed, Glassdoor, ADP, Harvard Business Review. And I want to note that there was an HBR survey, the Harvard Business Review survey, that was a study sponsored by Trusaic last year in partnership with SHRM, to really better understand how organizations are addressing DEI. And it was very consistent with what you're seeing as the numbers here. So, just really embracing that pay equity is not just about reducing risks, but taking it as an opportunity is what the shift is happening within the organizations, within leadership. We've had so many conversations with organizations where the leadership team, the C-suite team, the board members are really asking to embrace DEI, embrace pay equity, and move towards achieving pay equity. Next slide, please. Okay, so pay equity is being demanded, and if you want to promote pay equity, you need to take action. And really, what employers must look at in order to achieve pay equity or progress towards achieving pay equity is you got to compensate employees fairly. You got to ensure equal opportunity when it comes to hiring, promotion, retention, promote a positive workplace culture. And if you do conduct employee feedback or surveys, it's just not enough to collect that information and discuss it and then put it aside. Organizations need to act on the employee feedback. So it's really what it comes down to is really actions, data, and employee sentiment. All of it needs to align. Otherwise, you're going to have a pay equity perception gap. So what that would mean is, let's say if you were to conduct a pay equity audit, which 66% indicated that they're in the middle of conducting a pay equity audit. Let's say you conduct the pay equity audit. However, you don't communicate that to employees, there could be a pay equity perception gap. Because once you run a survey on the employees, there may be a situation where the employees indicate, hey, I don't think I'm paid fairly, whether it's with respect to the market, whether it's with respect to my colleagues within the organization. I don't think I'm paid fairly. Now, the organization, however, on the other hand, the compensation teams, reward teams, councils, HR, is actually performing pay equity audits on a frequent basis, but there's no communication to stakeholders, to employees, so there is that perception gap. So it becomes very important to not just analyze the data, but also communicate that to stakeholders within the organization, externally, and those kind of communications are going to be very different. Next slide, please. Okay, so just digging deeper into what is pay equity perception gap. The pay equity perception gap, and this is a definition on the screen, the pay equity perception gap is a notion that speaks to potential disconnect between what compensation data reveals and how employees feel about their employer's pay practices. So as an example, we've seen organizations, like I mentioned previously, we've seen organizations where they conduct a pay equity audit, and it's a spectrum. They conduct a pay equity audit, but never communicate the results. And anytime you run a survey on the employees, it turns out that they don't believe that the organization is practicing fair compensation or fair pay practices. So as you know, we've seen that repeatedly, and that's what we're talking about here as the pay equity perception gap, and to bridge that perception gap. So there's two main components to it, right? Conduct the audit, put into place fair practices when you're hiring, promoting individuals when it comes to compensation, but then simultaneously also survey the employees, understand what they think about the compensation philosophy within the organization, and then take actions to bridge that gap of perception. If and when you run that survey and they indicate that they don't think they're paid fairly, got to act on that and start to communicate to employees that this is how you form compensation. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're gonna launch a poll question here. Give it a couple of seconds more. All right, so the poll question was about, does your organization have a pay equity perception gap? 33% of the attendees responded yes, 25% said no, and 42% said, I'm not sure whether there's a pay equity perception gap. You know, so again, it, you know, if I take the 33% that said yes and you know, and add the 42% there, again, it's roughly about 66%, where it's either yes, it's around 70, you know, 76%, and I'm not sure about whether or not there is a pay equity perception gap. So something to kind of think about within the organization, especially for the individuals that indicated, the 66% that indicated that you are in the middle of conducting a pay equity audit. Next slide, please. Okay, so next what we're going to go into is, how do I bridge the pay equity perception gap? And you know, we look at this in more detail in the next few slides, but the gist of it is really to address the pay equity perception gap. Number one, conduct frequent pay equity audits. Now that frequency can be, it can depend on an organization. You could have, we've seen all the way, again, it's a spectrum. We've seen all the way where an organization conducts a pay equity audit once a year on, you know, on the entire organization, all the way to conducting it 4 or 5 times a year. And then also just kind of dividing it up by countries if you have global workforce. So it's a spectrum where we've seen, you know, all from the left to the right, left being once a year and right being 4 or 5 times a year. So the first step is that employers must conduct a regular pay equity audit. As a function of that pay equity audit, you should be able to create equal pay bands for each of your position within the organization. So it's really the pay equity range that we call it. Everyone is familiar with the market ranges that are being used to create salary bands, salary ranges for each position within the organization. But we're saying there's another range that sits on top, which is an equitable pay pay range, which is the pay equity range. And that is a function of the pay equity audit, a function of the statistical modeling that you're conducting. So that's the second step. The third is run an employee survey and collect employee feedback regarding compensation. So among many other things in the employee survey that you're asking, there should be a section focused on compensation. So you understand what is happening at the ground level, and understand how the employees feel. Now, once you do that, you'll understand the relationship between the pay equity or the compensation within the organization and the employee perception. After this, you're taking steps to really align the sentiment, right? So that's where you're drafting up. If you do actually conduct a pay equity audit, there's no issues identified with respect to gender, race, ethnicity, the intersectionality, or other protected classes, and you're going to communicate that to the employees. That's the action that you're taking at that point. And then really, as a function of creating those equitable pay ranges that sit on top of the market pay ranges, be transparent about how the compensation is decided and how do individuals go from one level to the other level. Be completely transparent about that. Now, again, it's a spectrum on how transparent you want to be, but think about how transparent the organization is comfortable with. A lot of organizations start with start small and then scale it up to being completely transparent, where the entire compensation philosophy is available to the employees. Next slide, please. So getting into the details about how do you bridge the pay equity perception gap. Setting goals, that's the main thing, right? So you're talking about there's really two components in setting the goals. One is you're defining your team that's going to be working on this, and then you're defining the metrics that are going to be tracked, that are going to be analyzed, that are going to inform what progress looks like, that are going to inform how do you measure those the pay equity or the pay equity perception gap. You're defining the metrics. So in order to set your goals, like I said, define your team that's held accountable for meeting the pay equity goals or the pay equity perception goals. Choose a senior level, VP or above, person with strategic insight to lead the team. Council should be included. It's not, again, we've seen it all over where some organizations always include council in this, or sometimes they don't want to include council, but council should be included on the team to provide legal oversight. And then there is an executive level sponsorship or commitment that should be included from the executive leadership team. So that's your team. Obviously, then you have the team members that are actually going to do the analyses, run the surveys, and track those metrics that we're talking about. Step number 2 is defining the metrics. So you identify the metrics that you will need to measure. Start by really implementing a pay equity measurement system, and confirm that your system ensures data quality and integrity. Very important. Bad data is obviously going to lead to skewed results, which is going to give, again, bad metrics and then bad decisions. So data quality, integrity, very important. Once the PE metrics, once shared, become discoverable, so focus on great data, right? And measure your baseline and set your goals, and then track progress, right? So that's what setting goals is all about, right? What is it that you want to achieve? Define the team, make sure the metrics are clearly laid out. This is what we're going to measure. And those metrics shouldn't change over time because you are looking at tracking progress. Next slide, please. Step 2 is accountability. So the team that was chosen or that was formed, in step 1, we got to make sure that there's accountability for measuring or for ensuring that those goals are being met and they're being met on time. So there's accountability. you got to establish that top-down structure, and selecting individuals that are going to be accountable for achieving that pay equity as well as closing the pay equity perception gap. Several organizations have implemented these types of initiatives, like McDonald's, and a result has been greater success in hitting goals, including achieving pay equity for women and other underrepresented groups across its 180,000 US workforce. So that's very important accountability. Um, some organizations implement accountability goals on the individual worker level and review their, through performance reviews. And then, some think about accountability as making goals publicly known. So there's transparency, there's greater accountability that individuals need to be, meeting. So that's step number two, is making sure that you're holding the individuals responsible or accountable, and tracking that progress towards achieving the goal. We've also seen recently that there are some organizations that are tying bonuses of executive leadership team to such KPIs, but then again, it's important to establish what those KPIs or metrics are going to be, as we talked about in step one. So that's another way to think about it, as accounting for or tying certain leadership bonuses towards achieving those KPIs. Next slide, please. Okay. Step three is transparency. Very, very critical for solving the perception gap. So really, again, to reiterate, we conduct the pay equity audit. We ensure that the employees understand how compensation is structured internally. What happens when they move from position A, which is at, let's say, level A, to level B, or level 1 to level 2? How does their salary change? And now with laws going into effect, as Joanna had mentioned previously, employees are going to have access to that data. They're going to have access to what the salary range is when I move from, let's say, level 1 to level 2, because if they are in, let's say, a software engineering position and the organization is hiring for a senior software engineer, they're going to see those ranges. And that's what they're going to expect to be paid as and when they get promoted, if not more. So, just getting proactive about sharing those salary ranges internally could be another way to, just increase the transparency within the organization. Now, include salary ranges, disclosures, and public job listings. We've seen some organizations basically just disclosing those ranges in states that are requiring them to do it. But then we've also seen organizations where they're saying that we're going to just release it all over because of the remote work that's happening. Someone sitting in Colorado where you're supposed to release the range of California, and then someone's in a state where such requirements are not there. They can still see, and they're in the same position, they can still see what the range is of a software engineer in California or Colorado. So certain organizations have taken a decision where they're saying that they're going to adopt this in the US, if not globally, and release salary ranges for all positions. Now, in order to do that, obviously, you want to make sure, to Joanna's point, that you're not creating a wage compression issue, pay compression issue, where you're posting ranges to attract new talent within the organizations that's higher than where your current individuals in that position are at within the organization with the tenure, with the time and position. So as a function of your pay equity analyses, we talked about having that equal pay ranges for each position. Those equal pay ranges will incorporate market competitiveness as well as equity within those ranges, which is going to make sure that situation like that does not happen where you're attracting new talent and their range is higher than someone already within the organization with a tenure. If done correctly, it'll account for that. Next slide, please. Okay. So those were some of the steps towards really thinking about how do you bridge a pay equity perception gap. The key takeaways really is conducting frequent pay equity audits and running the employee surveys with compensation in there, and then taking actions on what the employees perceive as the pay equity within the organization, or just generally compensation structure. Now, pay equity is a moving target. It requires commitment. It's just not a one and done effort where you're just checking the box. I conduct a pay equity audit today, and then every 2 years, I'm going to conduct a pay equity audit. With with hiring, with people changing levels, people changing positions, people leaving the organization, a one-time pay equity audit is not going to cut it with so much rapid transformation that's happening. So you got to make sure that there's some cadence around pay equity analyses, including proactively forming equitable pay ranges to ensure that there's a pay inequity issue that's not being created within the organization at the time of hire, promotion, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's really about commitment, and it's a continuous effort. We see organizations talking about, I have, or the organization has committed towards pay equity, or committed towards achieving pay equity, or even achieved pay equity. When you read through the lines, what they really mean is that they're committed towards constantly doing this analysis, constantly ensuring that there's no pay inequity that's being created, and then over time, for a sustainable process, creating those equitable ranges within which the recruitment team within the organization or the hiring manager has access to those equitable ranges, and those are the ranges that they're hiring within. Now, there are extenuating circumstances where you may have to go outside of those ranges, but then again, if you have an easy way to refresh the analyses, it can immediately tell you that these are the individuals that you need to give a pay increase to if you're bringing this employee outside of the range in order to not create a pay equity issue. So there are tools that can assist with this process, and would highly encourage the attendees today to go look at some of those tools, and those tools can really make this process easy. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the tools is the pay parity tool, and it certainly does all of the things that we talked about, including employee surveys. And it analyzes all forms of compensation. It will tell you at the intersection of protected classes, especially gender and race ethnicity, what the pay disparities are within the organization. And pay disparities are really pay gaps that are statistically or not justified, right? So every organization will have a pay gap, but if you can explain why that pay gap exists and statistically prove it, that's when there is really no pay disparity within the organization. But if you can't explain that, then that's where pay disparity is formed. And a lot of times, we've also seen this where organizations do a gender specific pay equity analyses and a race ethnicity specific pay equity analyses, and they take steps to remediate. But then the moment, and then the remediation is done, now they're confident that, hey, we've achieved pay equity, we're going to keep monitoring it. However, when you run the intersection of gender and race ethnicity, they still have pay disparities. So make sure when you are running those audits, especially for the 66% that indicated you're in the middle of it, you are accounting for gender and race ethnicity together, not separately, together. I can't stress how many times we've seen organizations indicate that they've achieved pay equity, but the moment they run the intersection, there's still some problems there. Prevent wage compression, very important. So it'll help you prevent wage compression. It'll help you communicate progress confidently with various permissions, various roles, recruiter view, hiring manager view, so you can communicate progress confidently, even invite leadership with limited view. You can always maintain attorney-client privilege through the system. Your attorney or counsel, if you want to involve them, will be the administrative user that is the only person that will be able to invite other users to the system. And then comply with various pay equity laws, not just SB 1162, which is the recently passed law in California, but Illinois, different states, Colorado, New York, Massachusetts, Oregon, and globally, Switzerland, UK, right? It helps with compliance. And then easily refresh the pay equity so that you are pay equity analysis, so that you're constantly monitoring pay equity progress. So all of this can be achieved through the tool called Pay Parity, and it's all in one solution. Very easy to use. It's integrated with different HCM systems too. Next slide. A module within the pay parity system, which is very important, especially with these transparency laws going into effect, and if you're trying to bridge the pay equity perception gap, is the module within the pay parity system called Equal Pay Estimator, that as a function of your pay equity analyses forms equitable pay ranges for each position, layers that on top of market data, layers that in top of your own tools that you subscribe to for market data, so that you have a holistic picture of every time you're hiring, your hiring managers, your recruiters have a range that incorporates equity to hire within. So they're not creating inequities every time they're hiring. So that's the equal pay estimator. It's about being confident every time you're hiring, be confident that you're paying fairly to your to your new hires. Next slide. All right, we'll there's another poll question that we're going to launch. Give it a couple of seconds here.
While we're waiting, Anuj, maybe given that we only have 7 minutes left, let's start answering some of the questions that got posted in either the chat box, question box, or DM to me. Okay, so with that, one question was asked: can employers provide just the starting salary range, or do we need to provide the entire salary range for the position? The question is going to depend on the jurisdiction, but most states that have a pay transparency law, they are asking for a salary range. So essentially the min-max, not just the minimum. And some states have actually been very specific that when they are talking about salary ranges, they don't mean, like, for example, up to $60,000 or $60,000 plus. Neither of those would fit the salary range, at least in some jurisdictions. So you want to know, for the state the states that you are looking at, you need to make sure that it matches the language of the law. In California, for example, the one that's going into effect on Jan 1, that applies to employers with at least 15 employees. And you will need to identify, they call it pay scale, but it's basically the salary range. So the minimum and the maximum that the employer reasonably expects the employer, to pay the employee. Also to note, in addition to pay, some jurisdictions also, require you to provide additional information, such as a description of, the additional benefits that you would be getting. I don't know that that's, causing anyone any consternation, but I just wanted you to be aware that some of the jurisdictions, there's nuances in between, among the jurisdictions, but I just wanted to be clear that it's not necessarily just pay, but that's obviously the bulk of it. Okay, another question is, do you find the acceptance of pay transparency varies based on age/generation, with younger employees being more open and comfortable with talking about wages? The answer is absolutely. That is, I've been working for, too long. I graduated from law school like well over 20 years ago, and I've just sort of seen over the years how things have changed and sort of attitude. But there are so many surveys, you could, Google them and see the surveys that younger people, where they work, from a social purpose, pay equity, those are far more important. And, sort of historically, employees, I'll just say, were encouraged not to share salaries with each other, but younger people are far more open about talking about it. If you look at the various surveys that's been conducted, there's a definite trend of younger people being more comfortable talking about it, and perhaps that's fueling the pay transparency law kind of tsunami that's happening. And transparency is not monolithic. Transparency doesn't mean, therefore, you need to identify every person's salary. In fact, that's actually what you should not be doing. You should not be, personally identifying the salaries. But, transparency can be macroscopic. Survey after survey, employees want to see pay transparency. That doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for every employer. For example, part of transparency can be being transparent about your methodology. You just conducted this pay equity audit, you've achieved pay equity, and here is the things that we consider in how we determine pay, and being transparent about that, the methodology. You can also, disclose the pay ranges. It doesn't have to be the average salaries. I mean, there are different ways to disclose it, but the key is you want to make sure that what you disclose is consistent with kind of the message, the narrative that you're giving to your stakeholders, whether they're your employees or the public, in terms of, your commitment to pay equity. I think we have time for only one more question. There's another question here. Can you please define equitable pay bands? How's that different from traditional pay bands? Well, when we were talking about equitable pay bands, we're really talking about is the pay band or the pay range, like, for example, like through our software, our Equal Pay Estimator software, it provides you the range of pay that you can offer a job applicant that won't essentially muck up the pay equity that you've just achieved. I mean, pay equity is not a static thing, unfortunately. Workforces are fluid. People get hired, people get fired, people get raises, so on and so forth. So it's changing throughout the year. And so doing a pay equity once, it only tells you what that snapshot is. You want to be monitoring it for a variety of reasons that Anuj had talked about. You want to be tracking it over the year, and then doing another audit the following year. And as part of that, when you're looking at like the determining what you should be proposing for pay for a new job applicant, you've conducted the pay equity audit, you've run the analytics, you've looked at the, you've tied it to the external benchmarks that, software such as ours, the Equal Pay Estimator, it links to, it'll give you a range. So that, that's giving you guidance on what the pay band or the pay range should be in order to make sure you are maintaining pay equity in your, as a result of your pay equity audit. I think that's all the time we have. And I apologize for my lack of video. I had some technical issues on my end. And let me turn it back over to Hester. And thank you very much for your time. And by the way, our contact information is at the bottom. If you have any others, please feel free to directly contact us. Back to you, Hester.
I'd like to thank our presenters as well as all of you for joining us today. If you'd like to view this webcast again, the archived recording will be available on the hr.com website within 24 hours. The webcast credit will show on your hr.com account within 2 business days, and we'll also send you an email with your credit information. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment to fill out the exit survey that opened in a new browser page on your computer. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.